Suffering arises from attachment. So, what is our ultimate goal? After realizing that the world is illusory and suffering in nature, we will seek to reduce our strong attachment to it. Don't think that all suffering is caused by external factors. In fact, it is our own minds that create trouble and suffering. The root of all suffering is attachment. When we are strongly attached to something, it controls us. Any changes in it will dominate our emotions. Once we let go of our attachment to it, it becomes irrelevant to us. It won't dominate our state of mind, nor will it bring us any suffering. Let's take relationship as an example. When A is deeply attached to B, every action of B will affect A's state of mind. Even the slightest dissatisfaction can be devastating for A. However, after they break up and become like strangers without any emotional attachment, no matter what happens to B, A won't be affected, let alone feel very sad. If we don't let go of our strong attachment, it will definitely bring about great harm and suffering, which will far exceed the happiness it initially brings us. This refers to the suffering of change. The harm and suffering it brings about far exceed the so-called satisfaction it initially brings us. Sentient beings are really pitiful. They have nothing worthy of our envy. It's not easy to clearly realize that the three realms are like a burning house. I don't know if you have thoroughly understood the three types of suffering. The types of suffering. Apart from teaching us about the impermanence of the world, Shakyamuni Buddha also taught us that all contaminated things are suffering. All suffering can be categorized into three types. If you thoroughly understand these three types of suffering, you can clearly understand any suffering. The first type of suffering is the suffering of suffering. It is the suffering that everyone recognizes. The second type is called the suffering of change. It refers to the situation where a person temporarily enjoys a good living environment and doesn't feel any suffering. However, if they leave this comfortable life and no longer have favourable conditions, the suffering they experience would be even more intense than that of an ordinary person. This is because they have become accustomed to their previous way of life. Just as the saying goes, it is easy to go from frugality to luxury, but difficult to go from luxury to frugality. It's easier for a frugal person to gradually become extravagant, while it's very difficult for someone accustomed to a luxurious lifestyle to become frugal. If a person who has enjoyed happiness experiences suffering, they may commit suicide. On the other hand, a person who is accustomed to suffering may live joyfully. If their suffering gradually diminishes, they will even feel very happy. So, how does happiness arise? When suffering arises and then it diminishes, one will feel happy. If Cinderella marries into a wealthy family, she will live a happy life, no matter if her prince rides a white horse or a black horse. There are many such stories in movies. A person experiences a lot of suffering in their childhood, perhaps being an orphan or disabled. Gradually, due to some of their qualities, they become more and more fortunate and start living a happy life. Such stories usually follow the same pattern: how to change from suffering to happiness, and how to be free from suffering. What they call freedom from suffering is actually a reduction in suffering. Does it mean that they have no more suffering after getting married? In fact, suffering will continue, and new forms of suffering will arise. We have all learned about the suffering of change. The so-called suffering of change means that the current experience, rather than the experience that follows, is suffering. It's like commuting a death row inmate's sentence to life imprisonment. The death row inmate was originally in great distress, but when he hears that his sentence has been changed to life imprisonment, he feels happy. But what is there to be happy about being sentenced to life imprisonment? While serving the life sentence, his fear of impending death may decrease to some extent. At least he knows he won't die for the time being, so he may feel the so-called happiness. However, he is still in prison, still suffering. What happiness is there? It's just that his fear of impending death disappears. He still has to continue his life in prison, where he may be bullied by others, often suffers and has no freedom. These are all suffering. In other words, he still has to experience these suffering. But at least he won't face the death penalty, so he feels happy. This is what is known as the suffering of change. The all-pervasive suffering is a more subtle form of suffering. In the 400 verses on the middle way, it is stated clearly: the high experience mental suffering, the common experience physical suffering. Day by day, these two types of suffering torment people in the world. There are two types of suffering in the world. What the lower class of society experiences is often the physical suffering, such as hunger, cold, and fatigue from physical labour. The upper class, on the other hand, experiences various mental suffering. These two types of suffering torment all humans every day. The so-called diseases of affluence, such as diabetes and hypertension, are caused by mental suffering. Moreover, there are various mental illnesses. In fact, many children from wealthy families are prone to suffering from mental illnesses. Why? Because they don't need to engage in physical labour. I've heard that during the Cultural Revolution, some young people in Beijing who had depression or other mental issues were sent to the countryside for reform, and in 3 months they all recovered. They have really recovered without even taking medication. After engaging in lots of physical labour in the countryside for a few months, they had no time to feel depressed. Where would they find the time to ponder anything? They were exhausted from the physical labour. At that time, their only concern was to eat and sleep well, with the lowest expectations. In such circumstances, any mental illness could be cured. Hence, it's easy to cure mental illnesses. If all mental illness patients were sent to such places, most of their mental illnesses would be cured, because they wouldn't have time to ponder anything. If they are assigned to engage in physical labour without any time to ponder, they would become exhausted and could fall asleep immediately at night without any time to feel distress. Mental illnesses are caused by useless pondering, which may lead to insomnia. If you make them engage in 10 hours of physical labour during the day, would they still suffer from insomnia? They would definitely have a good sleep. For example, let's say a mental illness patient can carry 100 pounds of weight. If you ask them to carry that 100 pounds of weight up to the 8th floor, then their mental illness definitely won't arise. Would their mental illness arise at that time? When they are carrying the weight, they definitely won't suffer from the mental illness because they will be focused on carrying the weight up. Therefore, the best way to treat mental illness is to make them engage in physical labour. It's useless to take medication, as that only numbs their nerves and doesn't address the root cause of the illness. Medications only make them drowsy, unable to think, and fall asleep. It dulls their brain, anaesthetizes their neural system, and prevents them from thinking. Western medicine uses this method to suppress mental illnesses, but it's not a good solution. It causes great harm. The best solution is the Buddha's teachings, which help them understand the root cause of the illness. The only way to cure such people is to make them engage in a physical labour. If they can't be cured in this lifetime and are reborn as a cow after death, labouring every day, their mental illness may be cured. When they are reborn as a human again, their mental illness won't arise. The only way to treat mental illness is to refrain from pondering, and gradually their karma will diminish. Many people were concubines in the imperial palace in their past lives. After being selected into the palace, if the emperor had no time for them, they would think a lot. Most of the concubines in the palace had mental issues. They would either recite the Buddha's name or suffer from mental illness. These were the only two possibilities. This is really the situation. In Beijing, I have seen many people who lived in the palace in their past lives, and they are exactly like this. Their mentality is twisted. They recite the Buddha's name on one hand, but have mental issues on the other hand. Many people who stayed in the palace in their past lives are like this. On one hand, they have mental issues. On the other hand, they believe in Buddhism. Those who cultivate well tend to have fewer mental issues, while those who cultivate poorly are more prone to experiencing mental illnesses, though they also believe in Buddhism. There are many such people. I heard that there are 500,000 leftover women in Beijing, and they are unwilling to get married. Why? This is also a karmic habit. It's because in their past lives they married people with high social status. So in this lifetime, if they are asked to marry an ordinary man, they would be unwilling and uninterested. That's why many women in big cities don't want to get married. In their past lives, they lived in wealthy families, but in this lifetime, they don't have the merit. Moreover, the men they are interested in have either become monks or been reborn in the Pure Land. They have all embarked on the spiritual path instead of staying in the mundane world. As for the other men, they are not interested. This is the situation, so they are also suffering. Many women in Beijing and Shanghai are very unhappy because they cannot get married. They have high standards, so it's natural that they can't find suitable partners. This is suffering, including the suffering of change, and all-pervasive suffering. When they are trapped in the dilemma, they don't know why, but as outsiders we can see it clearly. This is related to their past lives. I'm not joking. Nowadays, men in the world are selfish, secular, and only interested in indulging in pleasures. There are very few men with high qualities. In the age of Dharma decline, the quality of men is getting worse and worse, even in the Buddhist community. This is the situation. During the Tang dynasty, there were so many great masters and male practitioners, but how many are there now? Among Buddhist practitioners in the age of Dharma decline, how many male practitioners are there? Most of them are female practitioners, and there are very few male practitioners. Originally, renouncing worldly life was supposed to be done by men. However, now it is the women who have taken on that role. Alas, how many male practitioners are there? Very few. Similarly, there are very few outstanding men in the world. Therefore, when there are slightly outstanding men in the world, women would compete for them because everyone likes them. These men also suffer. There are very few outstanding men. This is the situation in the age of Dharma decline. So, in this age, many women who can't find suitable men to marry choose to become monastics. Of course, some people have stronger roots of virtue. They have already experienced these things in their past lives. So, in this lifetime, they choose to become monastics when they are young. They have also experienced numerous worldly things in their past lives, similar to others. In fact, everyone's journey is similar, without exceptions. All sentient beings are more or less the same. Some people may choose to become monastics from a young age in this life, but they may have already been monastics in many past lifetimes. Many lifetimes ago, they were just like everyone else, going through worldly things. After experiencing frustrations in relationships, they began to experience a mixture of love and hate. When they saw their partner, they liked them, but once they were together, they started to dislike them. After going through this kind of experience again and again, they gradually generated renunciation. Those who have the opportunity to engage in Dharma practice have great merits, but they still have karmic habits. In the past, women from wealthy families suffered a lot. In the male-dominated society, women had to experience a lot of hardships. Nowadays, women have much more freedom. Women have experienced a lot of suffering. That's why there are many female practitioners and monastics now. There is a reason behind it. They have experienced so much suffering that in this lifetime, as long as the conditions are right, it's very likely for them to become monastics. Moreover, there are very few outstanding men, which makes them feel even more disappointed. Therefore, many women choose to become monastics and diligently engage in spiritual practice.